You're on the air. Don't say anything crazy. Hello everybody and welcome to edition 29 of Brobears Talk. Welcome, Andre.
Thank you, Brotherly Bear. I am intrigued as to what we will be talking about. Keep me hanging and the audience no longer. Do tell.
Okay, I will now spill the beans, as it were. So today we're going to be discussing the political event that nobody cares about, that political scientists all over the world put in the footnotes of their findings, and that is the Canadian election that is dawning upon us on September 20th of this year.
Justin Trudeau! Pow!
Pow! Justin! Canada's nicest man that keeps doing offensive things.
The politest of polite Canadians.
The polite centrist. The do not offend anybody, left or right. Yes, it's Justin. He's called an election 2 years early, and a lot of political scientists. Yes.
That's not registered on my Politico edition.
Well, that's why I told you that this is the event that nobody cares about.
Well, they don't. So why we're doing a podcast about it?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and hopefully that will be apparent over the next.
No, Brotherly Bear, I won't jeopardize it before the eggs hatched. Do go on.
Do not smash the eggs before they hatch. I think that the Canadian election is it's definitely kind of a muted political event. Doesn't have the clout that you get from kind of the US election or the UK election, right? But it is certainly an important one. And right now we have Justin Trudeau, who went into calling the election 2 years early with a lot of confidence, and the stats and the public temperature check said that he was very much going to be the victor. But now the conservative Erin O'Toole is creeping up on the polls, and Justin, in a recent provincial election, lost Nova Scotia, which is out on the Atlantic provinces, usually a Liberal stronghold. So, if I say so myself, he's probably shitting it right now.
Brotherly Bear, Nova Scotia, is that, for the layman here, which I am,
yes.
Is that very much a Liberal province?
Yes. So, I will actually go through the kind of provinces of Canada, so or not one by one, but on a regional level. So you've got the Atlantic
because that would be worrying, right? If a particularly liberal province such as Nova Scotia were seemingly flipping, this does set a worrying precedent for the seemingly quite audacious push and step to call an election early. I mean, it's always a sign of confidence, if not arrogance, on the edges sometimes.
Yeah, it's an incredibly worrying result. I mean, the Atlantic provinces are usually left social democratic leaning liberal strongholds. They've been traditionally the most impoverished part of Canada, with a bit of a monoculture relying on the fishing industry. So to the layman, Canada is, I mean, I think this is an excellent quality, but Canada's an extremely resource-rich country. It's the second biggest country in the world. Huge amount of oil reserves, oil and natural gas in the west. Massive agricultural industry, forestry, as well as in the fishing industry. And, resources actually determine elections, and we'll talk a bit about that later with respect to the oil and gas industry. But the struggling economies of the East Coast, so you're kind of, your Prince Edward Islands, your Nova Scotias, your New Brunswicks, Newfoundland and Labradors, those make up the Atlantic provinces, traditionally liberal strongholds. But the prominence of the Liberals dwindled, and the Tories took Nova Scotia in the last election. Sorry, in the provincial election, which happened earlier this month. So, at the end of August. So that's very worrying for Justin, and on a federal level, that's worrying for kind of Liberal voters everywhere.
And the eyes appealed are obviously for the next sort of indicative results from other provinces. What's up next? Are the eyes peeled for any particular provinces in terms of initial indicative results?
Yeah, so to give you a bit of idea of the Canadian system, it's very much modelled on the federal level after the UK system. So similarly, it's a constitutional monarchy, and basically you've got a House of Commons and you've got a Senate, and the House of Commons has 338 constituencies, or as they're known colloquially here, ridings. Now, generally, the East, and as we were saying, Canadians you've met before, from your Ontarios, your Quebecs, from cities, very kind of urbane and metropolitan areas like Montreal, and the Toronto kind of metroplex, Ottawa, and also way out west in British Columbia, in Vancouver. These are kind of liberal strongholds. Now, if you look at the last election map, all of Alberta and all of Saskatchewan and all of the interior of British Columbia, the kind of traditional West and Prairie provinces, was 100% blue. There was not one red liberal patch on the map. So at the moment there's a lot of guesswork going on. The statistics say that they're kind of neck and neck, but I'd be very surprised if Alberta or Saskatchewan went away from the kind of their conservative roots. The only threat to that is the NDP, which is a socialist party, and even the Conservatives would rather. Well, a lot of Conservatives in Alberta would rather vote for the NDP than the Liberals. The Liberals are hated out west.
And the NDP, for the layman here again, sort of define where they sit with all of this.
Yes. So the NDP they're on the further left. So you've got the Conservatives on the centre right. You have the Liberals on the centre left, and the NDP are on the far left. And they're run by a gentleman named Jagmeet Singh.
And just out of curiosity, how many provinces, if any, are within NDP stronghold?
So the NDP I don't think they've ever taken an entire province on the federal level, but they actually had the government in Alberta, which is surprising. So
no way, really? You would have thought the polar opposite, right?
Yeah, so the interesting thing about provincial politics in Alberta is it's very much governed by kind of blue-collar interests. The Liberals are seen as the party. They're seen as the metropolitan elite. So you've sort of got your kind of North London liberal elite in the UK that are sort of very pro-Remain and often quite conservative in monetary ways, liberal in political way, liberal in social ways. The Liberals are seen as that. So blue-collar workers and ranchers and farmers, they went from conservative to voting NDP and just skipped out on voting Liberal.
Right, okay.
Yeah. So it's interesting, but it's definitely anyone's guess as to who's going to win. The problem is the Liberals have kind of they've got this image that they only represent the east of Canada. They only represent your Torontos, your Montreals, Ottawas, your kind of eastern provinces. And that's very much, the West takes umbrage at that because, and I've sympathized with the West because they get generally less funding, but they produce all the resources. They produce all the corn and the agricultural stock and the oil and gas. And there's a bill called the Equalization Bill in Canada that unlike in the States where they kind of just let the states do what they want, they actually pull money from the West and give it to provinces like Quebec where the economic forecast is less favourable.
Would you say the Canada, in terms of a simplistic model, is a two-party system, roughly speaking, very much sort of a Labour Conservative as we have over here? But I suppose what is held. I mean, that tends to be the case in most large free world Western economies, political, I suppose, dynamics, right? It does tend to be two large parties at loggerheads of each other, switching places and proclaiming change every time they run an election campaign, whatever that means.
I think that's a great question, because that talks to I suppose the nature of politics and how you get this kind of duopoly.
It speaks to the nature of reality. Everything has I feel like we've always talked about how the nature of the phenomenon, rather, of polarity is so pervasive. It's everywhere.
Yes, yeah, definitely on any level, and there's certain structures that help that become a reality more than others. So, for example, in the US, you've got a first past the post, winner takes all system, and the winner takes all aspect of that basically makes it pointless to vote for any other party than the Republicans or the Democrats. We're a bit luckier than that in Canada and in the UK, and what I mean by that is there's room for third parties on the right.
Well, hang on, Brother Bear, just before you carry on, if we stick with the US system, isn't there still elections on the state level that respect nuance?
Well, that's a good point, but this is kind of a federal comparison I'm making.
Fine.
So
got it.
So yes, on the
federal.
Federal ammunition. So on the state, buckshot to the face. On the state level, yes, you're absolutely right, Brother Bear. You've got elected sheriffs, you've got local mayors, and governors. There's a hell of a lot of nuance. On the federal level, the winner takes, the electoral college system makes it far more prohibitive for third party entrants. The closest...
That is a shame, right? I find that's a shame, because therefore you exclude potentially exciting new avenues and ways of thinking and ways of governing.
Absolutely. You've got to either fit nicely and squarely into either the Democrat bundle or the Republican bundle.
God damn the rule of polarity, the universal law of polarity.
I know, it sucks. And the sad thing was, Brother Bear, that the only time in the collective memory where that didn't happen was in the Bush-Gore election, where Ross Perot was a sort of third-party maverick candidate, and he took a huge percentage of the vote.
Actually, Brother Bear, I always find that whenever a US election rolls around, there's always the conversation, or there is an element of the conversation that speaks to or refers to, at times, an independent. I'm running as an independent. And that happens, right? Albeit that it's never successful. At least the idea is still alive and kicking on some level.
Yes, I mean, I think that there's huge public appetite to move away from this system, because Americans know that they're stuck with, a Hillary and a Trump.
Well, isn't it just a depressing seesaw at the end of the day?
That's a great way of explaining it. It's a very depressing seesaw, a very predictable seesaw, And there's dynasties, right? I mean, the Kennedys were a dynasty. They were like America's royal family. The Clintons are a dynasty. The Bushes are a dynasty.
That's a really good point. Can you tell me a bit about the Kennedy dynasty for my unpolitical mind?
Yeah, so obviously you had John F. Kennedy, but
yep.
you had the prominence of Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy, and Kennedys in the kind of caucuses and the lobbying that influenced, basically had a huge sphere of influence in people's lives in the US, and these go beyond who people voted for. So the Kennedys as well, with how they're kind of deified and glorified. You got the John F. Kennedy Memorial Highway, Memorial Airport, Memorial Building.
Very monastic.
Very
monarchical. Sorry, monastic. That was completely the wrong word. What I meant by that was very much like a monarchy, a lineage.
Yes, I think Kennedy's sex life was far from monastic.
Absolutely. It was completely the wrong choice of words. Monastic, maybe Joe Biden, but certainly not Kennedy.
Yes. Joe Biden, monastic, forgetful and monastic. But
We do need to talk about that at some point, Brotherly Bear. I've seen some recent clips, and it is, I mean, what really quite terrifying. Really, but to think that is the state, the mental state of the most powerful man, arguably, well, in theory, on the planet, the leader of the free world.
I know. It beggars belief, really. I think that the Biden administration there's a good chance that his advisors have a much more forthcoming role than previous incumbents. So
words like he's standing and he's going to take questions. He's like, I've been given this list here, and I've been told to call on Brenda there from CNN first. Yes, please. But this is no exaggeration. Like, it's not like Trump, who was, if you realize, and this is what worries me about the media. There is a bias in the media in America, seemingly, towards the more liberal side. And so there was very much sort of a pack of dogs attacking Trump. And maybe he enjoyed that. Maybe he encouraged that to some extent, you could argue.
Yes.
And I wouldn't necessarily dispute that, because he loved being in the limelight regardless of what the situation was and regardless of what he came across like. I think the interesting thing about Biden is that you do feel like there are multiple puppet masters in the background telling him what to do just for appearance's sake. I think there's an incredibly large amount of signs that indicate towards true incompetence at this point. And it's just almost a cardboard cutout that's being pushed out for external viewing purposes. But I can't see him. I can't see him surviving the 4-year term. I'm really. Really, because I feel like Kamala Harris will come in at some point, whether that's a year from now or 2 years from now, because I feel like the mental degradation is such that there's no stopping it. There's a natural process in place, and there's no stopping that at this point. And it's just scary to see some of, because completely, like, from an unbiased perspective, it's worrying to see that as the leader of the free world, articulating his ideas, his policies in the way he does, and almost unable to answer questions unless they are predetermined, and then his answers, I'm sure, are pre-programmed and predetermined as well by his team in the background.
Yes, that's incredibly worrying. And I think your comment earlier, there's a liberal bias in the media. There certainly is right now. I think there's also a general bias in the US media towards the establishment candidate, and the reasons behind that are probably far deeper than we can imagine, in terms of monetary gain. But I look. Another prime example would be George W. Bush. He was a cocaine addict, an alcoholic, a D student. There was nothing intelligent about George Bush, and most of his decisions were governed by 6 or 7 prominent advisors. The media generally didn't attack him much, because he was part of a dynasty, right? As the Bidens, the Clintons are, and I think that's the issue with US politics, is that dynasties are guarded, because that's where the lobbying money goes. And I would say in the 80s there was a conservative elite. In the 2020s or the 2010s, there's a liberal elite. There are elites and establishments that are defended by the media, and depending on when you're watching, they flip from left to right.
I think a really interesting dynamic that I think is starting to come to the fore and being more apparent, and the veil is very much being lifted of traditional media, in terms of what the power of traditional media to put a veil between the public perception and the reality behind closed doors. And I think social media, to a large extent, is doing a lot to lift that veil up and actually see these people for who they are, which are human beings who are, as faulty as anyone else. And I think the traditional media put this very permanent, very convincing veil for the longest time between us and them.
Yeah.
Where actually now there is almost a realization, and an obvious realization, to the point of like, well, of course, they're only human. Of course, they're prone to the same mistakes and the same thinkings and the internal speak that I am. And I think it's just a very fascinating time in that respect, philosophically, that, although, yes, on the face of it, you always knew they were human, it's truly coming across in a way. There's one way, there's understanding that concept, and then there's understanding that concept.
Yeah, I think that's an astute point, because we live in a very rocky and interesting place. The ground beneath our feet, when it comes to how we consume media, is shifting.
Well, it's so much more dynamic, because you used to rely on 1 or 2 or 3 channels back in the day, in the 50s, in the 60s, and arguably up until very recently, the last few decades, it's only kind of been these more fluid, more dynamic, more permeable social media platforms that have actually given us a look behind what's happening backstage. Yeah.
There's far more misinformation now through social media, but there's also far more transparency, and the truth and information is no longer controlled by 2 or 3 major conglomerates.
I would actually argue there's more misinformation, but there's also more transparency. There's both. There's more of both.
That's right. It pulls both in both directions, because you see levels of transparency and humanism in leaders that you never ever saw before. The great statesman, those days are gone. Obviously, that opens a door for far more lies and fake news to come to the fore. But you're right; it pulls in both ways.
It does.
They're polar opposite, but it does pull in both ways there.
There is a cost to that, yeah, that we take. But I think it's such an interesting dynamic that's only sort of at the beginning of its maturity curve, in terms of, what are the social economic implications of us truly understanding politicians as human beings. I think that's a non-trivial realization, and I'm not sure where it finishes.
Yeah, and I think Trump was a catalyst in that realization, because he's someone that rolled in it and loved it. He reveled in the fact that he was, he's someone, he was openly fine with people's knowledge that he slept with prostitutes, and that he did this deal and that backdoor deal, and he didn't give a shit. He completely pushed the limits and the boundaries of what it meant to be a politician. So he was a catalyst, and it worked in tandem with the way we consume information now.
He was the standard bearer for populism, right? Whatever that means. He was very much, infamy is great, because sort of the old adage, any news is good news, or any publicity is good publicity.
Right.
And so I think to a large extent, consciously or non-conscious or subconsciously, he leveraged that truth to his advantage.
I think that's all he had as well.
I think that is all he had. I think it was all smoke and mirrors. It all was big words, bombastic. It was about outrage, but seemingly enough. And again, it goes back to social media. Remember the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal.
Yeah. That on a statistical level played a role. How prominent that role was, we'll never know, and it's always going to be guesses and different takes on it. But yeah, as an individual, I think that Trump was, he changed the game when it came to populism and what it means to be a politician.
I think he's changed it forever. Like I think, love him or loathe him, he's changed the political game permanently.
He has certainly, and I think people be far more comfortable now voting for an outsider, and I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I think that could pull in any particular direction. But Trump, was he a good politician, a good leader? Well, that's depends on where you stand on that. I mean, I would say in many ways no, but then at the end of the day, the world didn't implode like people said it would. And
I think outsiders, we need to be careful about that, because I feel like that's exactly what Hitler resembled, and I think it's all too easy to forget history. Churchill said that the next Nazis will call themselves anti-Nazi, and you're starting to see that in the very sort of fascist imagery of Antifa, for example.
And also groups like the Proud Boys.
Yeah.
There's dangerous groups out there that,
and it permeates companies, right? This whole like enforcement of equality is, if on the first surface of it, happy rainbows, but you start to dig a little bit, and there is an unpleasant enforcement of compliance.
Yeah, that's kind of the story of forced tolerance, and what we're seeing from certain leftist groups that does start to resemble kind of a pseudo-fascist.
I think it's not the message. It's how the message is being enforced, because everyone generally agrees with the message. It's the methods used that are questionable.
It's the methods that are used, and it's a kind of shaming of people that don't comply or aren't even aware that they're not complying with the new rules of conduct. But you see, Brother Bear, how interesting the Canadian election is. We've very quickly started talking about the Americans.
Well, exactly.
It didn't take us long.
It didn't take us long at all.
It took us a grand total of 15 minutes.
Yes, the BBC know where their money are, and hence have stayed well clear.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to. Yeah, go ahead.
I do want to get back to it, though.
I don't want to stray too far away, because I think there's interesting political tangents we can go on. We can talk about the dangers of Trump and populism, and the dangers of all these groups on the far left and far right. But I think we should hone it in a little bit, and we should give the Canadians some platform, even if it's only for another 10 bloody minutes. Just give them some time and recognition. I think that it's an interesting time, at least to be in Canada, and in particular, it's going to be an interesting way to see how the oil and gas industry is treated, because you've got, and this kind of relates to the work of Mr. Musk and the liberal endorsement of electric vehicles and the funding of that infrastructure, and in provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan, people are quite anti-EV. The oil and gas industry it kind of rules the roost in terms of people's survival, and therefore it informs people's political choices. So it's going to be interesting, because this election is very much about kind of climate and how we're going to, going forward, how we're going to take action to respond to the latest UN warning bell, or say fuck it and just keep going for oil and gas.
Being our Brobear in Alberta and the man on the ground over there, do you feel like the Conservative candidate winning over there is a foregone conclusion at this point, or do you think there's even an outside chance of Trudeau winning that particular province?
I think that it's a foregone conclusion in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Honestly, Brother Bear, probably on a weekly basis, often more regularly than that, I'll see someone wearing a "Fuck Trudeau" hat or t-shirt or bumper sticker. There is honestly the amount of hatred for him runs deep here, in Alberta.
And is that chiefly, if we look at the root cause, because they see him as a threat to their livelihoods, namely the oil and gas industry?
I think it's that, and I think it's also they see him as a representative of Eastern Canada. A kind of this bilingual metropolitan man that only serves Ottawa, Montreal, Toronto, and these kind of Western cowboy interests are left in by the wayside, and that's what it comes down to.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
So that he doesn't have a hope in hell out here would be my answer to the question. But it's becoming more interesting because the Conservative leader, Erin O'Toole, has taken a far more environmentalist stance and is pandering to kind of the LGBT community as well. So,
do you think that might alienate him from his traditional voter base?
It might make people out here turn to the PPC, the People's Party of Canada, and they're more classically liberal, conservative, and populist. They're far more pro-gun, because that's another aspect in Canadian politics is gun rights. A bit like in the US, are also part of the debate. The Liberals have been slowly and quietly, I suppose they've been curtailing and banning certain guns and regulating them, grandfathering in old ones, and I think that's definitely going to have a part to play as well, because there's a lot of gun owners in the west of Canada.
And I think the gun ownership is as much a part of their identity as potentially livelihood out there, right? There are hunters, there's wilderness, but yes, I think the freedom and the liberty that's associated with owning a gun is a lot more than just the hardware of a gun.
It's the word you use was identity, and that's so true. You know, kind of the you've got the hunting and the trapping, but also that kind of that image of, you know, you're the free person living in the wild wild west, and you can arm yourself, you can defend yourself. I think that's a big part of people's identity here. You know, it's probably not a patch on what it is in the States, but it definitely exists here in a way that it doesn't in Europe.
Well, yeah, I remember our conversation with your friend from the gun store. Do you remind me of his name?
Jeff Collins, yeah.
Jeff Collins, yeah, that's right. And that was a fantastic podcast. I really enjoyed that. That was such a window into a world I wasn't that familiar with. But yes, it gave me a real appreciation for how much more guns mean to them than we can possibly imagine here in Europe, really not having that relationship with guns at all. And so that was such an eye-opener for me. Yeah,
I think guns are, you know, the gun culture, there really isn't a gun culture in much of Europe and the UK. The people's relationship with firearms in the UK is minimal to non-existent. I think it's just a completely different story. North America is, there's guns everywhere. The US, Canada, Mexico, you know, hunters, trappers, target shooters. It's very much part of the culture here. So a party on the federal level that's trying to curtail that is not going to be looked at kindly in certain jurisdictions.
So, Brotherly Bear, do tell me, where are we going to land? So what's the crucial date? What is election day?
Yeah, so election day is September 20th, so in 11 days' time.
Wow, that is not long.
No, and that hence the triggering of this podcast today.
My God, why didn't you say that at the beginning?
Yes. So it's 11 days, and it's going to be interesting because Quebec as well, and we haven't even talked about Quebec, will probably be largely dominated by the party, the Bloc Québécois, which is it's not liberal, not conservative. They're actually kind of a left-leaning party that believe in Quebec sovereignty and Quebec becoming its own country.
Oh, really?
Yes. So a little bit of information, and this is in some respects, Brother Bear, Canada on the provincial level is more separate. The provinces are more different than the states even. So I'll start with healthcare. When I came to Canada, I assumed that healthcare would be managed universally on the federal level. Not the case. Each province has its own healthcare system.
Right.
And each province has its own, you know, it can differ on the pharmaceuticals you can get and the operations you can get and the funding and the taxes are different. So, you know, you can have a completely different experience in Manitoba or Quebec in the healthcare system than you would in, say, Alberta.
So would you say it's far more regional and state-led?
Yes. Yeah, managed regionally and very different from region to region. But Quebec, unlike the rest of Canada, Quebec has very different laws, quite a different.
Well, it's hilarious. It's a bunch of Canadians that are adamant that they're French.
Well, exactly, and they speak French there, and the system is far more modelled over the European and French system there.
France.
So Alberta. The France, exactly. So the Quebec is over-regulated in the eyes of the rest of Canada.
Régulation de Versailles.
The Versailles. Clemenceau. Alberta, however, is 100% redneck Americana. It's like I met a friend from Connecticut a few months back, to Connecticut in the States, and she said that Alberta was far more American than anywhere in New England.
Really?
In the US. Yeah. Like the amount of people that own guns, the cowboys, the rednecks, the trucks, the lifestyles, hunting, fishing, everything. It's far more. It's more comparable to the American South.
What a wonderful
which
amalgam of different views and cultures in one country.
Absolutely, and this is what makes Canadian elections quite interesting, because you've got all these different cultures. You've got the redneckery of Alberta and Saskatchewan, but then hop over the line to BC, and British Columbia's it's like Canada's California. It's hippie dippy, pot smoking individuals. Quebec is its own country, pretty much. Well, it isn't its own country. They use a Canadian dollar. That's not a true statement, but its laws are far different to the rest of Canada and more aligned to Europe.
Further debate, I have a maybe unexpected question here. On your travels, recent and previous, have you sort of managed to move around different states and just get a feel for these cultures firsthand?
Yes. Well, only within the West. So I've been around Alberta, I've been around BC, and I've been around Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan is very much agrarian, low population, very religious. Alberta is kind of a hodgepodge. It's very much the Texas of Canada. It's like all about freedom, cowboys. You've got mountains, you've got badlands, swamps in the north. BC is beautiful, the people are far more kind of hippie and anti kind of authoritarian. I think the cultural differences are quite apparent between provinces, even within the West. So it's very different. I mean, the thing with Trudeau, there's not a huge amount people write about him, in the sense that he's not been a hugely prominent politician. But I'd say there's one thing he did, and I totally respect him for this. And that was in 2018, on the federal level, he completely legalized marijuana. And he did what any Western leader was too afraid to do. And he said, you know what, screw this. We're going to legalize marijuana, edibles, all those kind of things. And we're not just going to do it, say, in Ontario, or we're not going to let provinces decide. We're going to just do it everywhere. And I think that was a very bold move on a country as large and diverse as Canada to take that risk. And the federal government has made billions off of that move. Many provinces have chosen to pump those tax revenues, into education and healthcare. And I mean, for me, it's a freedom issue. You know, it's if people want to do that, I don't think they should be put in cages. And I think the Americans could learn a lot from the Canadian way of, how Canada treats marijuana here. And I think that was a great and interesting move by Mr. Trudeau.
Yes, I think it's a very clear and obvious next step in all Western economies that will come with time. It's crazy to think the level of legislation and legal bureaucracy around dictating what you can and cannot put in your body. I think in time we will look back at the draconian laws around possession and consumption of certain substances as, well, close to insane. because as adults, there's little reason as to why you shouldn't be allowed to, consume at your own risk what drugs you see fit.
Yes, yeah, I think on a fundamental level, why? I mean, I can totally see why a government would want to limit the intake, or at least regulate and monitor the intake of substances that are harmful, and have potentially adverse effects. But when it comes to substances like alcohol or marijuana, I think that there's really not much of a strong case for outright bans, and prohibition. Bill Hicks once said, that prohibition is so pathetic of marijuana that even the lazy stoners are winning. It's like all the armies and police and guns of the world, and the stoners are still winning. Like, that shows you how ineffective the war on drugs is.
Yeah, that's a great line. I'd argue. I was of that opinion until quite recently, but then you look at the amount of health impacts and devastation that alcohol causes. It's by far and away the most dangerous drug if you look at it from that standpoint, in terms of how it can ravage families. I mean, any drug, if abused, can cause massive harm. And I think just alcohol, by token of being the most widely used, is inevitably going to end up at the top of that stats list. But yes. I think, why not legalize everything? Not as some sort of crazy experiment, but I think sort of self-regulation, although there may be my belief in individuals and humanity is misplaced, should, be enough to keep people in society at large in check.
Yeah. I mean, they've certainly done that experiment in countries like Portugal and Mexico, and I don't think the results have been particularly alarming. You've got the self-administered, the kind of heroin centers and safe environments where you could administer intake of heroin. You've also got, I suppose, the decriminalization efforts where, you don't allow people to trade and sell cocaine, but it's decriminalized to possess it or take it. So there's different ways to look at it, but I'm in agreement with you that there should be more of a movement to reduce drug and alcohol dependency with a different approach that doesn't involve police coming along with batons and locking you in a cage for years because you've got a dime bag.
Yes. That's very true, and I think the Canadian system seems to be striking a good balance in terms of what it's almost tiptoeing into, and like you said, that was a very bold move from Trudeau's side to do that on a federal level, as opposed to what the US is doing, which is state by state and slowly sort of introducing it. The more liberal states being the first ones, like California, to do that. But yeah, that was a very bold move, and I think history will be kind to that decision.
I think you're absolutely right. History will look upon it favourably, and love him or hate him, and maybe he's seen as sort of kind of a bland leader by many, Mr. Trudeau. I think that I think that was a great move of his, and history will look upon him favourably in Canada for doing that. He's had quite a vocal environmental stance, which I think is definitely positive. But other than that, he's not. I mean, he's never been seen as kind of one of the great leaders. His father, Pierre Trudeau.
I was just going to say exactly, because there is a small dynasty to be had there, right?
There is a dynasty to be had there, and his father Pierre Trudeau was seen as far more intelligent, and an understanding of the distribution of Canadian interests across the provinces. But as a fairly bland leader, I think in this election it could go either way. Really, I think that the Conservatives could swoop out a lot of the votes. Quebec is probably going to be taken by the Quebec Bloc party, and the NDP, the Socialist Party, are also going to to sweep up some votes in different parts of Canada. I mean, let's not forget that Trudeau lost his majority government in the last election. So he's had a minority government for the past couple of years. So he's not in a great position already. But it will be interesting. There's it's kind of anyone's guess at this point, but the Liberals are kind of in hot water.
I'm really interested in how this turns out, especially how this shapes out over the next couple of weeks. But yeah, we could be in for a surprise result. Brother Bear, if you were a betting man, and I know you absolutely are, where would you put your money?
You know what? I think if at this point in time, if I was a betting man, I would just edge over and put my money with Trudeau still. And I think that's because the pandemic instability may call for some continued stability in people's lives. And people may say, you know what? We know what he's like. Let's just go with the incumbent. And let's stick with what we have for another few years and see what happens there. I mean, I think there's still a decent chance that Erin O'Toole would win, but I'd probably still put my money with Trudeau. Erin O'Toole is not a very high profile politician. He's a corporate lawyer and an ex Air Force. But beyond that, there's not much known about him. So I'd still say that people will go with what they know during the pandemic and put their money on Trudeau.
And what's the term he gets? 4 years?
I think it's it's 4, because there's a new fixed term act that puts the election every 4 years. So it's 4 years unless called before.
Okay, so he's in his second, just for context, and I should have asked this earlier, but he's in his second term now or first term still?
He's in his second term. He called an election again. I think he was elected in 2015. And then he called an election. He dissolved Parliament and called a second election after a few years. But in the second term, in the first election after his first term, he lost his majority. And a lot of people posit that was because of his painting of the face and things like that.
Right.
And I think most people are aware that he's not a racist, but that certainly hurt his profile. So
especially his sort of pristine liberal profile, I suppose, and every politician has some dirt that can always be kicked up, and social media is the most unforgiving, particularly. For any aspiring politicians, probably need to be scrubbing their social media as we speak.
Deleting everything from the past 20 years, yeah. Well, it's going to be an interesting election anyway, so I think with there we can wrap it up and keep close watch on the Canadian election on September 20th.
September 20th, just 3 weeks away. I'm looking forward to it, Brotherly Bear. Keep me posted, and we'll see who is victorious in 3 weeks' time.
We certainly will. Exciting times, and perhaps not the world's eyes, but our eyes will be on Canada.
Absolutely. Will you be voting?
I cannot vote as I'm not a Canadian citizen, but
no,
I'll be scornfully watching my friends and seeing how they vote.
Fantastic. If you could, would you say?
Oh gosh, that's and you know what? I don't think I've researched enough into it to say who I'd vote for.
So you've done a whole podcast on it, but you can't vote.
I can't vote because I don't feel any affinity towards the cast of characters.
You would opt
done
out,
some,
which I also have respect for that cohort. You have your reasons.
Yeah. There's years when I vote. There's years when I don't. And I don't know if I've got an affinity towards any of the players right now to vote. I would perhaps vote on the provincial election. I think definitely I would vote in that, but on the federal, I'm not sure.
And this enhanced status of yours that you'll be getting ultimately, does that allow you to vote on any level?
I think it allows me to vote on local levels, but not on federal.
Province.
Yeah, provincial, province, or local, but perhaps not on the full federal level.
Barrel. Brotherly Bear, well, thank you very much. It's truly been an education. Really has.
Thank you. I hope it's been useful, and let's see what Canada decides on September 20th.
Fantastic. Well, God bless you, and God bless Canada.
God bless Canada. Pow pow.